Some voices don't shout, they reshape the room by refusing to shrink. Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't come to argue, he came to draw a line, and one quiet moment on live television was enough. Enough to turn a smirk into silence, and a soundbite into something millions didn't know they needed to hear. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. The dressing room at CBS Television City didn't feel cold because of the air. It felt cold because of the silence. That polished, pressboard silence, wiped clean too many times, waiting for someone famous to sit, speak, and then vanish without leaving a trace. Arnold Schwarzenegger sat alone, elbows resting on his thighs, staring at the dim screen of his phone. No scrolling, just watching. It was an old video. Grainy, 1977. He was younger, stiffer, the Austrian accent thick like wet concrete. He tried to say the word responsibility and got stuck halfway. The host laughed. So did the audience. He had smiled then too back in that clip, but it wasn't joy. It was survival. Behind him, the flat-screen monitor on the wall glowed with the real-time logo. Countdown, 18 minutes. He looked down again. The video paused on a freeze frame of his young self smiling awkwardly. That was decades ago, but the sounds still echoed. He reached out and swiped the clip away. The knock came softly. The door cracked open just enough for a head to poke through. A young assistant, maybe in her 20s, wearing a headset and a clipboard she didn't seem to trust. "Mr. Schwarzenegger, you good? Need anything before we head out?" Arnold didn't answer right away. He glanced over at the vanity where someone, probably another guest, had left behind a paper cup of untouched coffee. Beside it was a framed black and white photo, probably part of the room's set decor. His eyes locked onto the image. A soldier, stern, clean-shaven, medals on his chest, uniform too familiar. He didn't speak, just nodded once. The assistant lingered, unsure if she should leave. Then she did. Arnold leaned back slowly. That photo, it wasn't his father, but it may as well have been. Gustav Schwarzenegger, officer, Nazi party member, a man who believed in order above all things. Arnold never talked about it much. Not because he was ashamed of who he was, but because he had spent his entire life becoming something else. He whispered something then, not out loud, just to himself. "I know what power looks like when it eats a man from the inside out. I ate dinner with it every night." The monitor beeped softly, 15 minutes. He stood up, adjusted the sleeves of his dark, simple jacket. No flashy logos, no red carpet tuxedo sheen, just cloth, clean lines, functional. Like everything else he'd built. He checked his watch, not for the time, but for rhythm. Then he walked out. The hallway outside the dressing room wasn't loud, just distant. The kind of quiet that follows you when people have already decided who you are. A tech nodded as he passed. Someone whispered something near the lighting booth. No one said it out loud, but it hung in the air. "He's the muscle guy, the politician." The punchline: he walked past a wall lined with photos, legends of late-night television. Men in suits, men with voices sharp as razors, men who never had to fight to be heard without being mocked for their accent. Arnold paused at the last frame. A younger Bill Maher, grinning sideways like he knew the joke before the rest of the world did. He held that gaze for a moment, not with anger, but with calibration. This wasn't his first stage. It wouldn't be the hardest, but it was one of the only ones where the lights came on before the truth did. He kept walking, toward the set, toward the laugh tracks, toward the seat across from someone who thought he already knew how this conversation would go. But Arnold wasn't here to fit into anyone's outline. He came to redraw it. The applause sign blinked. The theme song rolled. The audience clapped on cue, trained more by routine than excitement. Under the bright studio lights, everything looked polished. Every hair, every laugh, every gesture calculated to fit neatly inside a broadcast hour. Bill Maher leaned forward, smiling like he had a secret. "Welcome back," he said, then turned to the camera. "Our next guest, well, you know him, 7-time Mr. Olympia, action hero, former governor of California, a man of many titles, though tonight we'll find out if philosopher is one of them." The audience chuckled, not a roar, just enough to signal amusement. Maher turned to Arnold. "So Arnold, let's start simple. Do you really feel qualified to speak on political intellect? I mean, no offense, but from flexing biceps to flexing policy, big leap, isn't it? A few more laughs, sharper this time. Not cruel, but close. The kind of laugh that comes not from humor, but from the comfort of shared doubt. Arnold didn't blink. He adjusted in his chair, not shifting weight nervously, but anchoring himself more fully. His voice was low, even, as if he were replying to a question in a quiet hallway, not on national television. Intellect doesn't come from where you went to school, he said. It comes from how many times you refused to quit when everyone said you should. Maher smirked. Right, so muscle memory as political strategy, another laugh, the kind that tried to make the audience complicit in the joke. Arnold offered a smile. Small, not defensive, not amused. A smile meant for moments when the game had been played too many times and he already knew how it ended. I've trained muscles, he said, and I've trained minds. I've stood in rooms where no one thought I belonged until they realized I wasn't leaving. The laughter softened. One or two heads in the crowd nodded slightly. Maher didn't let up. But come on, let's be real. Do you ever worry that your celebrity insulated you from actual criticism? That maybe people let things slide because you're you? Arnold leaned forward slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to signal presence. I've been criticized since the day I got off the plane, he said, for my name, my accent, my body. None of it came with armor, just skin. Maher tilted his head. So you're saying what, being underestimated made you smarter? Arnold's gaze held steady. No, being underestimated made me patient. And patience teaches you where the real power is, when to speak, when to wait, and when to say something that doesn't need to be loud to hit hard. The audience quieted, not because it was a mic drop moment, but because it wasn't trying to be one, and that somehow made it land deeper. Maher's smile flickered for half a second. He shifted in his seat, folded a leg over the other, fingers tapping the armrest once, then twice. Let's get into substance then, he said. You've been vocal about values lately. What exactly are you hoping to change? Arnold didn't rush. I want people to stop confusing cruelty with strength, he said. And I want young people to see that dignity isn't weakness. That just because someone talks softer doesn't mean they carry less. Someone in the audience let out a low not loud, not dramatic, just honest. Maher picked up a pen from his notes, tapped it once on the desk. Well, we'll see how that lands in the real world, he said, almost under his breath. Arnold looked at him, eyes calm. It already has, he said. You just haven't noticed yet. And the room stayed still just long enough for the audience to feel something shift. Not big, but enough. Maher didn't lean back this time. He stayed close, elbows resting on the edge of the table like he was tightening the screws. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. When he spoke, it was slower, measured, not to soften the blow, but to ensure it landed where he wanted. A lot of people don't know this, Bill began, but your father, he served under the Nazi regime. That's a heavy history. Has that shaped how you see power, authority, or are we pretending that doesn't leave residue? The studio didn't go silent right away. There was a low collective inhale, the kind people take when they're unsure whether to laugh or brace for something deeper. Then the quiet settled, not the scripted, polite kind, the real kind. The kind that waits to see which direction a man chooses to go when his past is laid bare in front of an audience. Arnold didn't flinch. He didn't clench his jaw. He didn't blink like he'd been caught off guard. He looked down at his hands. They were still, weathered. The kind of hands that had held barbells, microphones, policies, pain. One vein throbbed slightly beneath the skin. He raised his head. My father, he said quietly, believed that control was the highest virtue. That strength meant silence. That apology was weakness. He let that hang. I was raised in a house where men didn't cry. Where no one said I'm sorry, even when they broke something, especially when they broke someone. Maher didn't interrupt. Arnold continued, I don't excuse what he was part of. I don't explain it away with history. That's the luxury of people who didn't live inside the aftermath. He sat back slightly, not withdrawing, just making space for the weight of what was coming next. I've spent my life not running from that past, but walking the opposite direction. Not because I'm better, but because I've seen what happens when men follow fear dressed as conviction. There was no drama in his voice, no raised volume, just deliberate pace, measured. Like each word had to pass through something heavier before reaching daylight. I didn't inherit his ideology. I inherited the silence, the shame, the walls that never cracked, and I decided not to repeat them. A cough echoed faintly from somewhere in the crowd. No one laughed now, not even the ones who had earlier. Arnold leaned forward. People look at me and think discipline came from the gym. But it came from walking away from a man I loved who didn't know how to love back. Maher's face shifted almost imperceptibly, the flicker of recognition, not agreement, but understanding. Arnold wasn't done. I've been accused of many things in my life, too ambitious, too loud, too American, but no one gets to accuse me of pretending that history didn't shape me. He paused. What you do with the past, that's where the real strength is. Not burying it, not weaponizing it, just refusing to be bound by it. Maher opened his mouth, but closed it again. Arnold glanced toward the crowd, not for effect, but as if speaking to someone just outside the reach of the cameras. I've made mistakes, big ones, personal ones. I know what it's like to break trust, to lose people because of ego. I've carried those moments longer than I carried trophies. He looked back at Maher. But you asked about power. So here's what I've learned. Power isn't how many people fear your voice, it's how few people have to recover from it. No applause, no dramatic sting, just stillness. Maher shifted again, this time more noticeably. He scratched behind his ear, then reached for his water, took a sip, and set it down slower than before. Arnold adjusted his blazer at the cuff, not fussing, just grounding. I don't carry my father's shadow, he said, voice low. I carry the light that comes after, and I've learned to make it enough. Maher tapped his pen once, maybe twice, then shifted his weight like a man trying to pivot without looking like he was retreating. All right, he said, fair enough. But let's bring this back to something people see every day. Hollywood, the spotlight, the cameras, the fame. You've built a legacy, sure, but does that really prove anything deeper? Or is it just success in a well-lit echo chamber? Arnold smiled. This one wider than before, not amused, not sarcastic. The kind of smile a man gives when the next thing he's about to say has been waiting inside him for years. You know, he said, when I first got to America, they told me I wouldn't make it. He paused, not for drama, but because the memory was heavier than he expected. They said my name was too strange, my accent too thick, my body too bizarre. They said I looked like a comic book character, not an actor. He glanced toward the audience, voice calm but unwavering. One studio head told me directly to my face that no one would ever buy a ticket to a movie with a lead actor they couldn't pronounce. He let that sit. Maher raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. So I kept showing up, Arnold continued. Auditions where they laughed before I even spoke. Screen tests where the punchline was me just standing there. He chuckled lightly. They called it a gimmick. A phase. Said I should stick to weights and disappear when it passed. He leaned in slightly, but I wasn't there to be accepted. I was there to endure. The audience stilled. No laughter now, just the kind of quiet that comes when something true is being handed to you without decoration. I learned something in those early years, he said. You don't have to fit into matter. You don't need to sound like them, move like them, think like them. You just have to keep showing up until the room changes shape to fit the truth of your presence. Maher opened his mouth, closed it, then half-smiled like someone just got outplayed in a game they thought they were winning. Arnold didn't stop. You asked if my success proves anything. It does, not about me. About what people miss when they only look at the surface. He sat back slowly. They thought my body was the product. They missed that discipline was the engine, that vision was the fuel. He held up a hand slightly. I don't say that to brag. I say it because there's a kid somewhere, right now, being laughed at for their voice, their name, the way they walk into a room. And I need them to know something. Another pause, clean, measured. Being different isn't a liability. It's a compass. And if you follow it long enough, it stops pointing at who you're not and starts leading you back to who you always were. A few people in the audience started clapping, not a thunderous standing ovation. Just hands, soft but certain, meeting in rhythm with something deeper than agreement. Maher looked toward the producer's booth, then back at Arnold. "You've clearly thought about this a lot," he said. Arnold nodded once. "When the world tries to flatten you, you learn how to carry dimension." And for the first time since the segment began, Maher didn't have a comeback ready. He sat still. Arnold looked ahead, not at Maher, not at the crowd, but somewhere past the lights. "I wasn't built to blend in," he said quietly. "I was built to stand and keep standing." Maher shifted in his seat again. This time it was sharper, more deliberate, like someone trying to steer the conversation back into a lane he felt safer in. "Okay," he said, "let's zoom out a little. You've spent decades blowing things up on screen, punching your way through walls, villains, and bad dialogue. Now you're sitting here talking about morality and restraint. Isn't that a bit off-brand?" The audience laughed. It wasn't cruel, but it wasn't gentle either. It echoed that familiar tone, the one that says, "We're all in on the joke, right?" Arnold didn't laugh. He didn't lean forward or sit back. He didn't bristle or blink. He let the question hang in the air like a weight no one else wanted to carry. Then he spoke. "When I was younger, I thought strength was about breaking things," he said. "I thought if you could push harder, lift more, crush what was in front of you, that meant you were powerful." Maher opened his mouth, but Arnold kept going, slower now. "Then I met a girl, Afghanistan, military hospital visit. She was maybe 10, no legs, lost them to a roadside bomb. Her mother stood beside her, holding a photo of the girl in a soccer uniform before the blast." Arnold's voice didn't crack, it didn't waver, but it softened. "I asked her what she missed most. Thought she'd say running, jumping. You know what she said?" He paused. "She said, 'I miss the sound my cleats made on the sidewalk when I walked to practice.'" The audience didn't move. No coughs, no whispers, just stillness. Arnold's eyes stayed steady, locked on something only he could see. "Then she looked up at me," he said, "and she smiled. She said, 'I still want to run, I'll just have to figure out a new way.'" He leaned in, not to perform, but like someone lowering their voice to make the truth clearer. "That day changed me. I realized strength isn't how loud you are. It's how quiet you stay when someone else needs the space to speak." Maher looked like he wanted to interrupt. He didn't. "I've lifted hundreds of pounds over my head, won trophies for it, but I've never felt smaller than I did standing next to that girl." Another breath. "That's when I started asking a different question. Not how much can I carry, but who can I carry quietly?" The camera didn't cut away. It didn't need to. Arnold's hands rested on the table, fingers still, voice low. "You know what no one teaches you about being strong? It's lonely. People cheer when you win, but when you fall, they expect silence." He looked toward the audience again, not dramatic, not for effect, just present. "So I stopped trying to win for applause, and I started standing for people who couldn't get up on their own." Maher finally found his voice. "But you're still known for being loud, commanding. That doesn't exactly scream humility." Arnold turned back to him. "Loud doesn't mean unkind," he said. "Commanding doesn't mean careless." He tapped a finger lightly on the table. "The movies, those were roles. Big, loud, exaggerated, but life, real life. That doesn't need explosions, it needs presence." Maher leaned back slightly, defensive without saying so. "So what are you now? A philosopher in gym clothes?" Arnold smiled, not big, not sarcastic, just enough. "No. I'm a man who learned the hard way that it's easier to build muscle than it is to unlearn pain." The audience was completely still. He let the moment breathe. "I don't preach. I don't pretend to have answers. But I know this: power is not measured by who you defeat. It's measured by who walks away standing after you speak." Maher blinked. Arnold folded his hands together. "That girl, she got prosthetics, learned to run again. Sent me a video 2 years later, sprinting across a field. She waved at the end, said, 'Told you I'd figure it out.'" He smiled at the memory. "I framed that photo, not because I helped her, but because she reminded me of what I had forgotten." "And what's that?" Maher asked, quieter now. "That strength isn't something you show, it's something you give." The room didn't applaud, not yet, but they heard it, all of it. The hallway outside the studio was quieter now. The applause had faded. The lights had dimmed. Someone down the corridor was rolling a metal cart over cables, the sound of wheels clicking against linoleum like a metronome for backstage routine. Arnold sat in the dressing room again. Same chair, same silence, but the weight in the air had shifted, not lighter, just fuller. His blazer was unbuttoned now. A small bottle of water sat on the table, half finished. He hadn't touched it during the show. The door creaked open and Ree stepped in. Clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, eyes wide. "You're trending," she said. Arnold raised an eyebrow. #2 on X, that clip. I wasn't made to fit in. It's everywhere. People are reposting it with music, quotes, subtitles in 10 languages. She walked over, held up the phone. The video was only 17 seconds long. A close-up of his face, his voice calm and steady, that sentence delivered without emphasis, but now branded across timelines like a slogan. Arnold looked at it for a second, then back at Ree. "What's #1? Some pop star fainted mid-performance. It's a whole thing," she said, scrolling. "Of course," he said, then leaned back in his chair. Ree hesitated. "Also, there's some heat. A few pundits are calling you a washed-up actor trying to be a philosopher." One headline said, "Schwarzenegger goes soft." Arnold didn't respond right away. He took a breath through his nose. "Slow, intentional, hashtags disappear," he said finally, "but I know who needed to hear it." Ree nodded. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Arnold stood, stretched his arms briefly, not like a man preparing for war, more like someone remembering what his body still carried. There was a knock at the doorframe. A producer, quick nod, "You're clear to leave." Arnold gave a polite nod back. The man was gone before the door even closed. Ree tucked her phone away. "You want me to schedule any interviews?" "No," Arnold said. "Not even the morning shows." He shook his head. "They want a reaction, not a conversation. I gave them the real thing already." She smiled faintly. "There's also a guy from some political blog trying to bait you with a think piece. Said you're pretending to be deep to stay relevant." Arnold chuckled softly. "It takes effort to ignore someone quietly," he said. "Let's put that energy to good use." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Outside the window, the city pulsed like it always had. Headlights, billboards, the hum of movement. But inside the room, there was stillness, not the kind that comes from being done, the kind that comes from being enough. Ree opened the door for him. "Let's go," she said. Arnold walked through without another word. The hallway looked the same, but it didn't feel the same, not because the world had changed, because he had chosen not to shrink to fit it. The folding chairs squeaked when the students shifted. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. It wasn't a glamorous auditorium, just a multipurpose room in a small community school east of the freeway. The walls were pale yellow, the ceiling tiles stained in places, but the air was full of something that didn't care about appearances. Arnold stood at the front, no microphone, no podium, just him. A couple dozen teenagers stared back, some skeptical, some curious, a few trying hard not to look interested. He had just finished speaking, not a speech, just a story, a reflection, about growing up with a voice no one wanted to hear, in a body everyone had an opinion about. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He just told the truth. A teacher thanked him softly and asked if anyone had questions. For a moment, no one moved. Then a girl in the second row stood up, maybe 14, small frame, dark hair tied in a tight ponytail. Her voice came out low, almost hesitant. "People laugh at how I talk," she said. "I came here when I was 7. They say I sound wrong, that I speak like I'm still learning." Arnold looked at her, not through her, at her. With the kind of stillness that made everyone else in the room fade, he walked closer, not to tower, to meet her space. "What's your name?" "Lucia," she said. "Lucia," he said slowly, "let me tell you something." He crouched a little, just enough to make his voice feel closer. "When I came to this country, people laughed too. I couldn't say refrigerator or squirrel. They thought I was funny before I opened my mouth. And when I did, they laughed harder." Lucia didn't look away. "But I didn't change my voice to make them comfortable," Arnold said. "I learned how to use it to make things better. And when you do that, when your words carry something real, no one laughs anymore. They listen." She nodded just once, not fast, not for show, just enough to mean it. "You don't need to sound like anyone else to be right," he added. "You don't need to shrink your voice to fit someone else's version of perfect." Lucia sat down, pulled out a small notebook from her backpack, and wrote something quickly. Arnold didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to, but later, the teacher told him. She wrote one sentence, "I don't need to match the mold to be true." Afterward, Arnold stepped outside. The afternoon light was soft. The city buzzed beyond the schoolyard, same as ever. Ree was waiting near the car. "You didn't post anything," she said, "not even a photo." He smiled faintly. "That's the point." As they pulled away, the school grew smaller in the rearview mirror. The internet would forget the trending clip. The pundits would move on to another headline. But somewhere, a girl named Lucia had written herself into the world just a little louder. And that was enough. Arnold didn't come to win a debate. He came to say something worth carrying. And sometimes the quietest words are the ones that stay. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.